Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected ways. Deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, old Silas Cutter lived alone. His only companions, the crackling fire and mountain winds. One cold morning, he found something caught in his bear trap that would change everything. It wasn't a bear, it was a giant wolf, bloodied but proud, staring at him with knowing eyes. Most men would have finished it off. Silas did something different. He freed it. Day after day, the old trapper nursed the wounded beast back to health. What started as mercy became something deeper. Two creatures who understood what it meant to survive alone. But what would happen when the harshest winter storms arrived? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains don't lie to a man, and they don't coddle him neither. Silas Cutter had learned that truth over 37 winters in these peaks, where the Bitterroot Range stretched like God's own backbone across the Montana wilderness. His cabin sat tucked into a grove of lodgepole pines, so far from civilization that the nearest neighbor was a 3-day ride through country that could kill you 6 different ways before breakfast. At 64, Silas moved through his morning routine with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that carelessness up here meant death. The leather journal lay open on his rough-hewn table, its pages yellowed and worn from years of careful entries. Weather observations, trap locations, animal sign, all recorded in his steady hand with a stub of pencil that had seen better decades. October 15th, he wrote, pausing to listen to the wind's voice through the pines. Frost came hard last night. Found fresh elk sign along Willow Creek, Winters. Come in early this year. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd built his life with his own hands and asked nothing from the world beyond what he could take fair and square. Hand-split logs chinked with moss and mud, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to catch the morning light without letting a sniper get a clean shot. Old habits from a war most folks had forgotten. But Silas carried those lessons like scars, invisible but permanent. His breakfast was simple: cornmeal mush, jerky from last year's deer, and coffee black enough to float a horseshoe. He ate standing at the window, watching the forest wake up. A red squirrel chattered somewhere in the canopy, and far off a hawk circled lazy spirals against the pewter sky. These were the voices that had replaced human conversation in his life, and he'd found them more honest than most. The war had ended in 65, but Silas had never really come home from it. Too many good men buried in Virginia soil, too many nights listening for footsteps that never came. When the killing stopped, he drifted west like smoke, carrying nothing but a rifle, basic tools, and the bone-deep need for space between himself and other people's troubles. The mountains had welcomed him with their harsh honesty, and he'd stayed. His trapline stretched 15 miles through country that would test a mountain goat. Deadfalls for marten, snares for rabbits, and the heavy iron bear traps that formed the backbone of his income. Beaver pelts brought good money in town, and the trading post in Missoula always had buyers for quality fur. It was enough to keep him in supplies, ammunition, and the few comforts a man needed when the snow flew. The morning air bit sharp in his lungs as he shouldered his pack and checked his rifle. A Winchester .73, worn smooth by years of handling, but maintained with religious care. In this country, your rifle was your life, and Silas treated his accordingly. The lever action moved like silk, and the walnut stock fit his shoulder like it had grown there. His first trap lay a mile down the ridge, positioned where a game trail crossed a small creek. Empty, but the sign looked promising. Deer tracks, fresh enough that the mud hadn't dried. He made a note in his mental map and moved on. The second trap held a young marten, its neck broken clean. Silas examined the pelt with a practiced eye, then reset the trap with efficient movements. The forest revealed its secrets to those who knew how to read them. Broken twigs at shoulder height meant elk had passed through. Claw marks on aspen bark told of a black bear marking territory. The scattered remains of a pine cone showed where a squirrel had been feeding. Silas read these signs like scripture, each mark and track adding to his understanding of the land he called home. By midday, He checked 8 traps and collected 3 marten and a fat beaver. The pelts would bring enough to keep him through the next month, maybe longer if he was careful. He stopped at Willow Creek to rest and eat a cold lunch, watching the water run clear over granite stones, worn smooth by countless seasons. The creek reminded him of another stream back in Tennessee where he'd grown up. His father had taught him to fish there, showed him how to read water and understand what lay beneath the surface. That man had been dead 20 years now, buried next to Silas's mother in a cemetery that probably didn't exist anymore. Progress had a way of plowing under the past, but up here time moved different. His afternoon brought him to the upper meadow where he'd set his largest trap. This one was positioned near a salt lick that drew deer and sometimes elk. The big trap was his pride, 40 pounds of hand-forged iron that could hold anything short of a grizzly. He'd made it himself in the forge back in Missoula, working the metal until it moved like a living thing. As he approached the trap site, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet, and the birds had gone silent. Silas stopped, letting his eyes adjust to the shadows. His hand found the rifle's stock without conscious thought, and he moved forward with the care of a man who'd lived this long by trusting his instincts. The trap was sprung, but what lay caught in its iron jaws made Silas's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't the deer or elk he'd expected. It was a wolf, but not just any wolf. This animal was massive, easily the largest he'd seen in all his years in the mountains. Its coat was thick and silver-gray, with darker markings around the muzzle and ears. One powerful leg was caught in the trap's grip, and blood had stained the ground beneath it. The wolf didn't struggle or snarl. It lay still, watching Silas with eyes that held something he recognized. The same weary dignity he'd seen in wounded soldiers who knew their situation but refused to break. There was intelligence in that gaze and something else. Respect, maybe. Or resignation. Silas had seen plenty of trapped animals in his years. Most fought until they injured themselves worse or cowered in terror. This wolf did neither. It simply waited, as if it understood that its fate now rested in the hands of the grey-bearded man standing 10 feet away. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind sighed through the pines, and somewhere far off a raven called. Silas found himself thinking of all the animals he'd trapped over the years, all the lives he'd taken for pelts and meat. It was the way of things up here, kill or starve, use what the land provided or go under. But looking into this wolf's eyes, he felt something shift inside him. The animal was old, he could see that now. Grey touched its muzzle, and there were scars along its flanks that spoke of a long life in harsh country. Like himself, this wolf was a survivor. It had lived through countless winters, faced down dangers that would have killed lesser creatures, and earned its place in these mountains through strength and cunning. Silas set down his pack and approached slowly. The wolf's ears flicked forward, but it made no aggressive move. Its breathing was labored, and he could see the pain in its eyes, but still it maintained that strange dignity. When he knelt beside the trap, the wolf actually turned its head to watch him, as if curious about what this human intended. The trap's jaws had caught the wolf's left rear leg just above the paw. The bone wasn't broken. Silas could tell that much from how the animal held itself, but the iron teeth had cut deep. Blood loss was the main concern now, along with infection if the wound wasn't cleaned properly. "Easy now," Silas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see what we can do about this." The wolf's eyes never left his face as he examined the trap mechanism. The release was simple enough, but he'd have to be careful. A wounded animal could turn dangerous in an instant, and those jaws could crush a man's arm without effort. But something in the wolf's behavior told him that wouldn't happen. Call it instinct or foolishness, but Silas trusted what he saw in those intelligent eyes. He positioned his hands on the trap's springs and began to apply pressure. The iron groaned as it opened, and the wolf tensed but didn't pull away. When the jaws finally parted, the animal carefully extracted its injured paw and settled back onto its side, panting heavily. Silas rocked back on his heels, studying the wolf. By all rights, he should put a bullet in it now. Wolf pelts brought decent money, and this one was magnificent. But as he looked into those knowing eyes, he found he couldn't reach for his rifle. Something had passed between them in those moments when he'd freed the trap, an understanding that went deeper than predator and prey. The sun was getting low, and the temperature was dropping. The wolf needed attention for its wounds, and Silas needed to get home before full dark. In 37 years in these mountains, he'd never done what he was about to do. But then again, he'd never met a wolf quite like this one. "You come in with me or not?" he asked quietly. The wolf studied him for a long moment, then struggled to its feet. It tested the injured paw gingerly, wincing but managing to put some weight on it. When Silas shouldered his pack and started down the trail toward home, the wolf followed at a careful distance, limping but determined. As they made their way through the gathering dusk, Silas wondered what his father would have made of this decision. The old man had been practical to the bone, never one for sentiment when survival was at stake. But he'd also taught his son that sometimes a man had to listen to something deeper than logic. The cabin's windows glowed warm against the darkening forest as they approached. Silas stopped at the porch steps and turned to look at the wolf, which had settled carefully onto its haunches about 20 feet away. They regarded each other in the growing shadows. Two old survivors taking each other's measure. "Well," Silas said finally, "I reckon we'll figure this out as we go." The wolf's ears pricked forward, and for just a moment Silas could have sworn he saw something like approval in those ancient eyes. The wolf didn't come inside that first night, and Silas didn't expect it to. Trust between wild things took time, and he'd learned patience in these mountains. He left a bowl of water on the porch and settled into his evening routine, but found himself glancing toward the windows more often than usual. Around midnight, he heard movement outside, the soft pad of feet on wooden planks, the gentle lap of a tongue against ceramic. When he looked through the frost-etched glass, he saw the wolf's silhouette against the starlight, drinking carefully from the bowl he'd left. The sight stirred something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Morning brought a dusting of snow, and the wolf still there, curled beneath the overhang of his woodshed. Silas watched it through his kitchen window as he made coffee, noting how it favored the injured paw, but seemed alert and responsive. The bleeding had stopped, which was good, but infection was still a concern in wounds like that. He'd dealt with injured animals before, but always as prey or livestock. This felt different. More like the field medicine he'd practiced during the war, when keeping a man alive mattered more than the convenience of putting him down. The comparison unsettled him, but he couldn't shake it. The wolf watched him approach with fresh water and a plate of leftover venison. Silas set both down about 10 feet away and retreated to the porch steps. The animal rose slowly, tested its weight, then limped over to investigate. It ate with deliberate care, eyes flicking between the food and the man who'd provided it. "You're gonna need that wound cleaned," Silas said conversationally. "Question is whether you'll let me do it." The wolf's ears swiveled toward his voice, and it paused in its eating to study him. There was consideration in that gaze, as if the animal was actually weighing his words. After a moment, it returned to the venison, but its posture had relaxed slightly. Over the next 3 days, a pattern emerged. The wolf would disappear during the daylight hours, returning each evening to sleep near the cabin. Silas left food and water and gradually moved the bowls closer to the porch. Each day, the wolf accepted the new arrangement without protest, though it maintained a careful distance from Silas himself. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Silas woke to find the wolf collapsed near his front door, its breathing shallow and rapid. The injured paw had swollen to twice its normal size, and red streaks of infection climbed up the leg like poison ivy. The animal's eyes were glazed with fever, and it barely lifted its head when Silas approached. "Damn," he muttered, kneeling beside the wolf. "Should have seen this coming." The infection had taken hold despite his hopes, and now they were racing against time. In the wild, this wolf would likely die within days, another victim of the mountain's harsh mathematics. But lying there on his porch, the animal looked less like a predator and more like something that had trusted him enough to come seeking help. Silas had medical supplies, basic field kit left over from his army days, plus the veterinary items he kept for dealing with his old mule. But treating a wild wolf was something else entirely. One wrong move and those jaws could end his story right there. The wolf made the decision for him. As Silas hesitated, the animal shifted slightly and placed its massive head against his boot. The gesture was so unexpected, so clearly a request for help, that it cut through all his doubts like a blade. "All right then," he said quietly. "Let's see what we can do." He fetched his medical kit from inside, along with a bottle of whiskey and several old towels. The wolf watched his preparations with fever-bright eyes, but made no move to escape. When Silas began cleaning around the wound, it flinched but held still, as if it understood that this pain was necessary. The infection was worse than it had looked from a distance. The puncture wounds from the trap had begun to fester, and the surrounding tissue was hot and swollen. Silas worked carefully, cleaning away the infected material and applying what antiseptic he had. The wolf trembled, but never tried to bite, even when the pain must have been considerable. "You're tougher than most men I've known," Silas murmured, as he bandaged the paw with strips torn from an old shirt. "And smarter too, seems like." The wolf's fever broke on the second day of treatment, but it remained weak and listless. Silas found himself checking on it every few hours, bringing water and small portions of meat. He rigged a shelter from canvas and pine boughs, creating a dry space where the animal could rest without being exposed to the weather. By the end of the week, the wolf was eating regularly and showing interest in its surroundings again. The infection had receded, though the paw would always bear scars from the trap. More importantly, the wariness in its eyes had been replaced by something else, not domestication, but a kind of partnership. It was during this recovery period that Silas began to understand how profoundly his life had changed. For 37 years, he'd lived by a simple code: take what you needed, waste nothing, and depend on no one but yourself. The wolf's presence challenged all of that. He found himself talking to the animal as he went about his daily tasks, sharing observations about the weather or commenting on the behavior of other wildlife. The wolf listened with apparent interest, its ears tracking his voice and its eyes following his movements. Sometimes it even seemed to respond, tilting its head or making soft sounds that weren't quite whines. The change wasn't just in his routines, it was deeper than that. For the first time in decades, Silas felt responsible for something beyond his own survival. The wolf depended on him now, at least until it fully healed, and that dependency created a kind of purpose he'd forgotten existed. 2 weeks after the trap incident, the wolf took its first tentative steps without limping. Silas watched from his porch as the animal tested its mobility, moving in careful circles around the cabin. There was still stiffness in the injured leg, but the strength was returning. That evening, as they sat in their usual positions, Silas on the porch steps, the wolf on a blanket near the woodshed, he found himself speaking thoughts he'd never voiced aloud. "Lost a lot of friends in the war," he said quietly. "Good men who deserved better than they got. Been wondering ever since if there was a reason I made it through when they didn't." The wolf's ears pricked forward, and it shifted to face him more directly. "Maybe this is it," Silas continued. "Maybe I've been up here all these years just waiting for you to show up in that trap." It sounded foolish, spoken aloud, the kind of sentiment his practical father would have dismissed as nonsense. But sitting there in the mountain quiet, with the wolf's intelligent eyes reflecting the starlight, it felt more like truth than anything he'd said in years. The next morning brought the first real snow of the season, not the light dusting they'd seen before, but the heavy, persistent fall that announced winter's arrival. Silas woke to find the world transformed, wrapped in a white silence that muffled all sound and changed the very nature of survival in the mountains. The wolf was gone. Silas searched the area around the cabin, following tracks that led away into the forest before disappearing in the falling snow. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of anything wrong. The animal had simply left during the night, as wild things do when they're ready to return to their own lives, standing in his dooryard, with snow accumulating on his shoulders. Silas felt the weight of solitude settle over him like a familiar coat. For 3 weeks, he'd shared his space with another living being, and now that presence was gone. The silence felt different than before, not peaceful but empty. He told himself this was how it should be. Wild animals belonged in the wild, and he'd done what needed doing by healing the wolf's injuries. It was the natural order of things, the way the mountains had always worked, but as he looked at the depression in the snow where the wolf had slept, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just walked out of his life. The routines that had sustained him for decades suddenly felt hollow, and the long winter ahead stretched before him like an empty page. For the first time in 37 years in these mountains, Silas Cutter felt truly alone. The days after the wolf's departure passed with the mechanical precision of a clock winding down. Silas moved through his routines, checking traps, splitting wood, maintaining equipment, but the familiar tasks felt different now, tinged with an emptiness he couldn't quite name. His cabin, which had always been a sanctuary, now seemed too quiet, too small, somehow incomplete. He found himself pausing in his work to listen for sounds that didn't come. The soft pad of feet on the porch planks, the gentle lap of a tongue against water, even the simple presence of another breathing creature nearby. The silence that had once been his companion now felt like an accusation. 3 days into this new loneliness, Silas discovered something that stopped him cold. Returning from his morning trap run, he found fresh tracks in the snow around his cabin, large, familiar paw prints that circled the building before disappearing back into the forest. The wolf had returned during his absence, close enough to investigate, but careful to avoid direct contact. "So you're still around," he murmured to the empty air, studying the tracks with the eye of a man who'd been reading sign for 40 years. The prints were clear and deep, showing no sign of the favoring he'd seen during the wolf's recovery. Whatever else had changed, the animal was moving well again. That evening, Silas left food on the porch as he had during the wolf's convalescence. The next morning, the bowl was empty and cleaned so thoroughly it looked freshly washed. But still no sign of the wolf itself, just those telling tracks that spoke of a presence hovering at the edges of his life. The pattern continued for over a week. Food left and taken, tracks appearing and vanishing, but no direct contact. It was as if the wolf was testing something, working through its own calculations about trust and territory and the strange human who had freed it from a trap. Silas understood the caution. Wild animals didn't survive by being careless around humans, and whatever bond had formed during the wolf's recovery was being tested now against deeper instincts. The animal was healthy enough to hunt for itself, strong enough to claim its own territory. It didn't need him anymore, which made its continued presence all the more significant. On a particularly bitter morning, when the thermometer outside his kitchen window read 15 below and the wind was howling down from the peaks like a living thing, Silas made a discovery that changed everything. He was checking his nearest trap when he heard something that shouldn't have been there. A low whimpering, almost lost in the wind's voice. Following the sound led him to a rocky outcrop about 100 yards from the trap, where he found a sight that made his blood run cold. A young elk, barely more than a calf, had fallen into a natural pit hidden by snow and deadfall. The animal was trapped at the bottom of the 6-foot depression, injured and exhausted from trying to climb out. From the tracks around the rim, it had been there since sometime the night before. Silas was calculating how to rig a rope system to extract the elk when movement caught his eye. The wolf stepped from behind a cluster of pines, moving with careful deliberation toward the pit. It looked first at the trapped elk, then at Silas, and something in that gaze was unmistakably communicative. "You found it first, didn't you?" Silas said quietly. The wolf's ears flicked forward, and it approached the edge of the pit. For a predator, its behavior was all wrong. Instead of the focused intensity of a hunter preparing to kill, there was something almost protective in its posture. It circled the depression once, then looked back at Silas as if waiting for him to take action. The implications hit him like a physical blow. The wolf could have killed the elk easily, A quick leap down, a swift attack, and it would have had meat for days. Instead, it had left the trapped animal alive and somehow communicated its location to the one human who might help. Working together without words, they freed the young elk. Silas rigged a rope system using deadfall and his own climbing gear, while the wolf kept the panicked animal calm with its presence, another behavior that defied everything Silas thought he knew about predator-prey relationships. When the elk finally scrambled out of the pit and disappeared into the forest on unsteady legs, both man and wolf watched it go. "That was something I never expected to see," Silas said, coiling his rope with hands that trembled slightly from more than just the cold. The wolf looked at him for a long moment, then did something that nearly stopped his heart. It approached slowly, deliberately, and touched its nose to his gloved hand. The contact lasted only a second, but in that brief connection, Silas felt something pass between them that was deeper than understanding. It was recognition. From that day forward, the wolf's visits became more open. It would appear in the late afternoons, sometimes sleeping near the cabin, sometimes simply sitting at the forest's edge, where Silas could see it. They didn't interact directly. The wolf maintained its wild nature and independence, but there was an acknowledgement now, acceptance of shared space that felt like the beginning of something unprecedented. Silas found himself adjusting his routines to accommodate this new presence. He began carrying extra meat on his trap runs, leaving portions where the wolf could find them. He modified his approach to certain areas, taking care not to disturb places where he'd seen wolf sign. Most significantly, he started paying attention to things that had never mattered before: the wolf's body language, the patterns of its movement, the subtle communications that passed between them. The old trapper's journal, which had recorded nothing but weather and trap results for 37 years, began to include observations of a different sort. November 3rd, wolf led me to injured deer caught in deadfall. Could have killed it easy, but waited for help instead. What kind of animal thinks past its next meal? And later, November 8th, found elk carcass cleanly killed with enough meat left for scavengers. Wolf's learning to share territory different than I expected. These entries troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. They suggested intelligence and planning that went beyond simple animal behavior, hinting at a complexity of thought that challenged his understanding of the natural world. More disturbing was his own response to these observations. Instead of the scientific detachment he'd maintained toward wildlife for decades, he found himself genuinely curious about what the wolf was thinking. The weather was getting serious now, with snow falling almost daily and temperatures that could kill an unprepared man in hours. Silas had weathered 36 winters in these mountains, and he recognized the signs of a hard season ahead. The animals knew it too. He'd seen them behaving differently, hoarding food and seeking shelter with an urgency that spoke of deep, instinctual knowledge. It was during one of these increasingly brutal days that the wolf appeared at his door in broad daylight, something it had never done before. Silas looked up from splitting kindling to find the animal standing in his dooryard, not approaching but clearly waiting for his attention. The wolf's behavior was different, alert but not agitated, focused but not aggressive. It looked at Silas, then deliberately turned its gaze toward the forest, then back to him. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. Every instinct Silas possessed warned him against following a wild predator into the woods during a snowstorm. But something in the wolf's behavior, combined with everything he'd learned about the animal over the past month, convinced him that this was important. He gathered his rifle and pack, dressed for the weather, and stepped into what would prove to be the most extraordinary afternoon of his long life in the mountains. The wolf led him through terrain he knew well, but by routes he'd never considered. Instead of following established game trails, the animal chose paths that offered concealment and strategic advantage, moving through draws that hid their passage, avoiding ridgelines where they might be silhouetted against the sky. It was like being guided by a military scout who understood the difference between moving and moving unseen. After an hour of this careful progress, They reached a narrow canyon that Silas had explored years before. He remembered it as unremarkable, a dead-end passage between granite walls that offered nothing but a small spring and some decent shelter. But as they approached the canyon mouth, the wolf's behavior changed dramatically. The animal dropped low, moving with the fluid grace of a hunter approaching prey. Its ears were forward, every muscle tense with focused attention. When it looked back at Silas, the message was clear. Danger ahead, move carefully. Silas felt his own combat instincts awakening, senses sharpening as they had during night patrols in hostile territory. He checked his rifle's action and followed the wolf's example, using the available cover as they moved deeper into the canyon. The sound reached them before they saw anything. Voices, human voices echoing off the stone walls. Silas froze, his mind racing through possibilities. In 37 years in these mountains, he could count on one hand the number of times he'd encountered other people away from the established trails. And never in weather like this, never in country this remote. The wolf had stopped behind a fallen tree that provided excellent concealment. When Silas joined it, the animal pressed close against his leg, not seeking comfort, but coordinating their position like a partner who understood tactical necessity. Through the screen of pine boughs, they had a clear view of what lay ahead. 3 men had made camp in the canyon's shelter, but this wasn't any ordinary hunting party. Their gear was expensive and new, their clothing more suited to a sporting goods catalogue than serious mountain work. 2 were young, maybe 30, with the soft look of men who spent their time indoors. The 3rd was older, greying at the temples, with the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders. What troubled Silas wasn't their presence. The mountains belonged to everyone who could survive them, but their behavior. They were arguing, voices raised in anger that echoed off the canyon walls. And scattered around their camp was equipment that didn't belong to any legitimate hunting expedition. Surveying equipment, maps spread on folding tables, instruments for measuring and marking that Silas recognized from his brief time working railroad construction in his younger days. These men weren't here to hunt game, they were here to hunt something else entirely. Told you the old coot wouldn't be a problem, the older man was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Squatter's got no legal claim to anything up here. Forest Service will move him out soon as we file the proper papers. What if he doesn't want to move? One of the younger men asked. Been hearing stories in town about this Cutter fellow. They say he's dangerous. The older man laughed, but there was no humor in it. One old hermit against a mining operation backed by serious money? Please, we'll be pulling copper out of these hills within 2 years. And anyone who doesn't like it can find somewhere else to play Daniel Boone. Silas felt his blood chill. Mining. They were surveying his mountains for mining rights, treating the wilderness he'd called home for nearly 4 decades like a commodity to be stripped and sold. The casual way they discussed removing him, as if he were no more significant than a beaver. Damn, that needed clearing, ignited. Something in his chest that he hadn't felt since the war. The wolf sensed his tension and pressed closer, its own hackles rising in response to his emotional state, through some communication he didn't understand. The animal seemed to grasp that these men represented a threat not just to Silas, but to everything they both called home. They watched for another hour as the men worked, taking measurements and making notations on their maps. The canyon was just the beginning. Silas could see from their papers that they intended to survey the entire area, including the watershed that fed his creek and the meadows where he ran his trap lines. If mining operations moved in, the ecosystem that had sustained him would be destroyed within a season. More troubling was their casual confidence. They spoke as if the land were already theirs, as if his presence were a minor inconvenience to be resolved through legal channels or other means. The older man, clearly the leader, had the bearing of someone who'd forced people from their homes before and expected no real resistance this time. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the men began breaking camp. They'd be heading back to town soon, carrying their measurements and plans to whatever corporate offices had sent them. Once those wheels started turning, Silas knew from experience that they'd be nearly impossible to stop. The wolf touched his arm with its nose, drawing his attention back to immediate concerns. The men were packing their surveying equipment, but they were also checking weapons, rifles that looked more suited to shooting people than game animals. Whatever their official business might be, they were prepared for trouble. Silas made his decision with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 2 years of guerrilla warfare. These men threatened everything he'd built in these mountains, everything that mattered to him. They'd spoken of removing him as if his life and choices were irrelevant, as if 37 years of making a home in this wilderness counted for nothing. But unlike the scared old hermit they expected to find, Silas Cutter had skills that predated his life as a trapper. He'd been a soldier once, trained in reconnaissance and tactics by an army that understood the value of knowing your enemy. And now, with an unlikely ally who seemed to understand the stakes as clearly as he did, he had advantages these corporate scouts had never considered. As the men prepared to leave the canyon, Silas began planning. Not retreat or negotiation. Those options had been eliminated by their casual discussion of forcing him out. Instead, he found himself thinking like the soldier he'd once been, considering assets and weaknesses, terrain and timing. The wolf watched him with those intelligent eyes, and Silas had the strange certainty that it understood what was happening. These men weren't just threatening one old trapper's solitude. They were threatening the wilderness itself. The complex web of life that both man and wolf depended on. We're gonna need to get a lot smarter about this, he whispered to his unlikely partner. The wolf's ears flicked forward in what looked remarkably like agreement. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, 2 survivors who'd found something worth protecting in the harsh beauty of the mountains they both called home. That night, Silas spread his own maps across the kitchen table, hand-drawn charts accumulated over decades of living in these mountains. Every game trail, water source, and seasonal shelter was marked in his careful script, creating a record of the land that no surveyor's instrument could match. The wolf lay beside the wood stove, watching with what seemed like genuine interest as Silas traced routes and calculated distances. "They'll be back," he said quietly, more to himself than to the wolf. "Probably with more men next time, maybe some muscle in case the old hermit gets difficult." The wolf's ears perked at his voice, and it rose to approach the table. For a moment, Silas felt foolish for talking to an animal as if it could understand tactical planning. But then the wolf did something that made his breath catch. It placed one massive paw on the map, directly over the canyon, where they'd observed the surveyors. "You do understand, don't you?" Silas whispered. The wolf looked at him with those ancient eyes, and in that gaze, Silas saw intelligence that went far beyond animal instinct. This creature had lived in these mountains longer than he had watched the subtle changes that came with each passing season. It understood territory and threat assessment as well as any military strategist. Over the next several days, they established a routine that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. Each morning, the wolf would appear at the cabin, and together they would patrol different sections of the mountains. Silas told himself he was checking trap lines, but in truth, he was conducting reconnaissance, cataloging approaches, identifying defensive positions, and noting any signs of human intrusion. The wolf proved to be an invaluable partner in this work. Its senses were far superior to his own, able to detect human scent hours old or spot movement that Silas would have missed entirely. More importantly, it seemed to understand the strategic nature of their activities, often leading him to vantage points that offered excellent observation of the valleys below. During these patrols, Silas began to notice changes in the wolf's behavior that suggested their partnership was evolving into something unprecedented. The animal no longer maintained the careful distance of their early relationship. Instead, it moved alongside him like an experienced scout, coordinating their movements with subtle signals that seemed almost telepathic. On the 4th day of their new routine, the wolf led him to a discovery that confirmed his worst fears. Fresh tire tracks marked a logging road he'd thought abandoned, and scattered along the route were survey stakes driven into the frozen ground. The mining company was moving faster than he'd anticipated, expanding their assessment to include areas far beyond the canyon where they'd first encountered them. Silas knelt beside one of the stakes, examining the official markings that declared this land subject to mineral rights exploration. The language was bureaucratic and cold, reducing the wilderness he loved to a collection of potentially valuable resources. Worse, the dates on the paperwork suggested they'd been working for weeks before he'd discovered them. "We're behind the curve here," he told the wolf, which had positioned itself as a lookout while he examined the evidence. "They've got lawyers and permits and all the machinery of civilization backing them up. What do we have?" The wolf looked at him steadily, and suddenly Silas understood what they had that the mining company didn't: intimate knowledge of this terrain, skills honed by decades of survival in harsh conditions, and a partnership between human intelligence and animal instinct that gave them capabilities neither could achieve alone. That afternoon brought visitors to his cabin, the first human contact Silas had experienced in months. 2 men in Forest Service uniforms stood on his porch, official documents in hand and expressions that suggested this was a duty they'd rather avoid. "Mr. Cutter," the older ranger said. "I'm Tom Bradley, district supervisor. This is Ranger Martinez. We need to discuss some changes coming to this area." Silas invited them in, noting how their eyes catalogued his cabin's contents and the wolf tracks visible in the snow around his porch. The wolf itself had vanished into the forest at the first sound of approaching vehicles, but its presence lingered in subtle ways that trained eyes could read. "Coffee?" Silas offered, playing the role of the simple mountain man they expected to find. "That'd be appreciated," Bradley said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Been a long drive up here." As Silas prepared coffee, he listened to their careful explanation of mining rights and federal land management policies. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. His decades of residence here carried no legal weight against properly filed corporate claims. He was being given advance notice of eviction proceedings that would begin within the month. "Now, the company's willing to be reasonable about this," Martinez added. "They're prepared to offer compensation for any improvements you've made to the property, help with relocation costs." "That's generous of them," Silas said mildly, refilling their cups. "Seeing as how this land doesn't belong to me in the first place." Bradley looked relieved at his calm response. "Exactly. We were told you might be difficult about this, but you seem like a reasonable man. The mining operation will provide jobs for the local community, bring development to an area that's been economically stagnant for decades." Silas nodded thoughtfully, asking careful questions about timelines and procedures while mentally cataloguing every detail of their visit. These men weren't his enemies. They were bureaucrats following orders, probably decent people doing what they believed was their job. But their presence confirmed that the situation was more serious than he'd realized. After they left, promising to return with formal eviction notices within 2 weeks, Silas sat on his porch and watched their vehicle disappear down the mountain road. The wolf emerged from the forest as soon as the sound of their engine faded, approaching with the cautious grace of a creature that had learned to associate human visitors with potential danger. "Well, partner," Silas said quietly, "looks like we're officially running out of time." The wolf settled beside his chair, and together they watched the sun set behind the peaks that had sheltered them both for so many years. In the gathering darkness, Silas found himself thinking about all the men he'd known who'd faced impossible odds. Soldiers who'd held positions they couldn't hope to defend, farmers who'd fought drought and locusts and economic collapse, ordinary people who'd stood their ground when everything reasonable suggested they should retreat. Most of them had lost, of course. That was the nature of impossible odds. But some had found ways to win that defied conventional wisdom, using unconventional methods and unexpected alliances to achieve what shouldn't have been possible. As the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Silas began planning not for defeat or surrender, but for the kind of asymmetric warfare that had made his reputation during the conflict that had shaped his younger years. He had advantages these corporate invaders couldn't imagine: knowledge, preparation, and an ally whose capabilities they would never see coming. The wolf looked up at him, and in its eyes Silas saw the reflection of his own determination. They would not go quietly into whatever future the mining company had planned for these mountains. The weather turned brutal 3 days after the ranger's visit, bringing the kind of blizzard that could trap a man for weeks if he wasn't prepared. Silas watched the storm build from his kitchen window, noting wind patterns and snow accumulation with the eye of someone who'd learned to read the mountain's moods. This wasn't just bad weather. It was the kind of storm that changed everything, isolating the high country from the outside world for days or even weeks. The wolf appeared at his door just as the worst of it hit, snow plastering its coat and ice forming on its whiskers. For the first time since their partnership began, the animal came inside without hesitation, shaking off the storm and settling near the wood stove as if it belonged there. "Smart choice," Silas said, banking the fire for a long burn. "This one's going to be a keeper." They spent the next 4 days trapped together in the cabin while the storm raged outside. During those long hours, Silas found himself observing the wolf's behavior with growing fascination. The animal adapted to indoor life with remarkable ease, seeming to understand house rules without being taught, staying off furniture, not investigating food unless invited, even positioning itself to avoid blocking Silas's movement through the small space. More intriguing was the wolf's obvious interest in Silas's activities. When he cleaned his rifle, the wolf watched every step of the process. When he studied maps or made notes in his journal, the animal would position itself where it could observe his work. It was as if the wolf was learning, processing information about human tools and methods with the same careful attention it would give to studying prey behavior. On the storm's 3rd night, something extraordinary happened. Silas was reading by lamplight when the wolf suddenly rose and moved to the window, ears forward and body tense. Seconds later, Silas heard what had alerted his companion, the distant sound of an engine struggling through deep snow. He extinguished the lamp and joined the wolf at the window. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the faint glow of headlights moving slowly up the mountain road. Someone was crazy enough to be driving in these conditions, which meant either emergency or determination that wouldn't be deterred by weather. The vehicle stopped about half a mile down the trail, well short of his cabin. Silas watched through his field glasses as 4 figures emerged and began unloading equipment. Even at this distance and in the storm, their purposeful movements told him these weren't lost travelers seeking shelter. "Company," he murmured to the wolf. "The kind that doesn't wait for formal invitations." The wolf's low growl confirmed what Silas had already concluded. These visitors meant trouble. Over the next hour, he watched them establish what looked like a surveillance post, complete with equipment that suggested they intended to monitor his cabin for an extended period. The mining company had apparently decided not to wait for legal eviction procedures. They were moving to direct action, probably planning to pressure him into leaving through intimidation or worse. In weather like this, help was days away, even if he could reach the outside world. They'd chosen their timing well. As dawn approached, the storm began to weaken, and Silas got his first clear look at what he was facing. 4 men, well equipped for winter conditions, with weapons that went far beyond hunting rifles. They'd positioned themselves to observe his cabin while remaining concealed from casual observation. Professional work, suggesting these weren't just corporate security guards, but men with military or law enforcement. Backgrounds: the wolf had been watching the surveillance post with the focused attention of a predator studying dangerous competition. When it looked at Silas, the message in its eyes was unmistakable. It was ready to act, waiting only for direction from its human partner. That afternoon, Silas made his choice. He couldn't wait for them to make the first move, couldn't hope that legal processes would somehow protect him from men who'd already moved beyond legal boundaries. If they wanted a confrontation, he'd give them one, but on his terms, using advantages they couldn't anticipate. He spent the day preparing, checking weapons and equipment with the methodical care of a soldier preparing for combat. His old field gear came out of storage, items he hadn't touched in years but had maintained with military precision. Body armor, night vision equipment, communication gear, and weapons that had seen service in conflicts the mining company's security team had probably never imagined. The wolf watched these preparations with apparent understanding, its own behavior shifting to match Silas's increased alertness. When he moved, it moved. When he paused to observe something, it did the same. They were synchronizing their responses like a unit that had trained together for years. As evening approached, Silas opened an old wooden chest that he'd hoped never to use again. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were items from his military service that went beyond standard infantry equipment. Specialized tools for infiltration and sabotage, devices designed for operations where conventional tactics weren't sufficient. Among these items was a leather-bound notebook, his field manual from advanced reconnaissance training, filled with diagrams and notes about asymmetric warfare, psychological operations, and techniques for defeating superior forces through unconventional means. He'd written much of it himself, distilling lessons learned in the kind of conflicts that didn't appear in official histories. "Time to see if an old dog can remember some new tricks," he said to the wolf, which had positioned itself where it could watch both the notebook and the window overlooking the surveillance post. The plan that took shape over the next few hours was unlike anything Silas had ever attempted. It combined his knowledge of the terrain with the wolf's natural abilities, creating a tactical approach that would have been impossible with any purely human partner. The wolf's senses would provide early warning and reconnaissance capabilities that no technology could match, while its mobility in heavy snow gave them options that their opponents couldn't counter. More importantly, the psychological impact of their partnership would work in their favor. These men expected to intimidate an isolated old trapper into submission. They weren't prepared to face an opponent who had spent 2 years perfecting unconventional warfare techniques, much less one with a partner whose capabilities they couldn't begin to understand. As darkness fell on their second night together in the cabin, Silas felt a familiar sensation, the cold clarity that came before action, when planning gave way to execution and everything depended on training, instinct, and the trust between partners who'd learned to move as one. The wolf sensed his readiness and moved to the door, looking back with eyes that reflected both intelligence and absolute commitment. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, two survivors who'd found in each other the strength to stand against forces that threatened everything they valued. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the mountains wrapped in deceptive quiet under a blanket of fresh snow. Perfect conditions for the kind of operation Silas had in mind. The operation began at 3 in the morning, when human senses were dulled by cold and fatigue, but the wolf's remained razor-sharp. Silas moved through the forest like a ghost, using techniques he'd hoped never to need again, while his four-legged partner provided reconnaissance that no human ally could match. They approached the surveillance post from the northeast, where the terrain offered the best concealment and the wind would carry their scent away from the watchers. The wolf's ability to move silently through snow that would betray any human passage gave them an advantage that Silas exploited with surgical precision. The first man never knew what hit him. Silas emerged from the darkness behind the surveillance post like a specter from the war, disabling their communications equipment and neutralizing the sentry with methods that left no permanent harm, but ensured long unconsciousness. By the time the wolf materialized beside him, they had eliminated 1/4 of the threat without raising an alarm. The second and third men fell to similar tactics over the next hour: careful stalking, precise timing, and the kind of coordinated action that spoke of perfect trust between partners. Each takedown was clean and professional, leaving their opponents alive but helpless. Stripped of weapons and communication gear, it was when they approached the fourth position that everything changed. Silas was positioning himself for the final assault when the wolf suddenly froze, every muscle tense with an alertness that went beyond normal hunting behavior. Its hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled deep in its chest, not the focused warning of a predator, but something that spoke of recognition and old anger. Through his night vision scope, Silas studied the remaining guard and felt his blood turn to ice. The man's profile was familiar, triggering memories that came flooding back with devastating clarity. Older now, grayer, but unmistakably the same face that had haunted Silas's nightmares for 30 years. Marcus Cole. Captain Marcus Cole, formerly of the Confederate Irregulars, the man who'd led the unit that had destroyed Silas's company in the last days of the war. The officer whose tactical brilliance had turned what should have been a simple reconnaissance mission into a massacre that left 23 good men dead in a Tennessee valley that probably didn't even have a name. But Cole was supposed to be dead. Silas had seen him fall during the final assault, had watched him disappear beneath the waters of Elk Creek with a Yankee bullet in his chest. For 30 years, Silas had carried the guilt of being the only survivor of that engagement, the one man who'd lived when better soldiers had died. Now Cole was here, 30 years older but very much alive, working for a mining company that wanted to strip these mountains bare. The coincidence was too perfect, too precise to be accidental. This wasn't about mineral rights or corporate expansion. This was personal, a settling of accounts that had been deferred for 3 decades. The wolf's growl intensified, and suddenly Silas understood something that made the hair on his neck stand up. The animal wasn't just responding to a human threat, it was recognizing an enemy. But how could that be possible? Wolves didn't live 30 years, and this animal couldn't have encountered Cole before tonight, unless it wasn't just any wolf. The thought hit him like a physical blow, memories clicking into place with terrifying clarity. Stories from his youth about shapeshifters and medicine men, legends his Cherokee grandmother had told about warriors who could take animal form. Tales he'd dismissed as superstition until he'd spent 2 years fighting alongside men who claimed such abilities, who demonstrated skills that defied rational explanation. During the war, there had been rumors about Cole's unit, whispers that they weren't entirely human, that their leader possessed abilities that went beyond conventional military training. Silas had dismissed such talk as battlefield superstition, the kind of stories desperate men told to explain the inexplicable. But looking at the wolf beside him, seeing the intelligence in its eyes, and remembering all the things it had done that transcended normal animal behavior, Silas felt the foundation of his understanding shift like sand beneath his feet. "Dear God," he whispered. "What are you?" The wolf looked at him with those ancient eyes, and for a moment Silas saw something there that was unmistakably human. Recognition, understanding, and a depth of experience that went far beyond the few months of their partnership. Before he could process this revelation fully, Cole's voice cut through the mountain silence with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Might as well come out, Sergeant Cutter. I know you're out there, and I know what you've done to my men. Time we finished what we started in Tennessee." Silas felt 30 years collapse into nothing. Cole was using his old rank, the one he'd held during the war, confirming that this confrontation had been planned long before mining rights became an issue. Somehow Cole had found him in these remote mountains and engineered this entire situation as an elaborate trap. "You're supposed to be dead," Silas called back, his rifle trained on Cole's position. Cole's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "Takes more than a Yankee bullet to kill some folks, Sergeant. Though I'll admit, it took me longer than expected to track you down." 37 years is a long time to spend hunting one man. "Why?" Silas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because you cost me everything," Cole replied, his voice carrying decades of accumulated hatred. "My unit, my war, my whole damn cause. When you survived that ambush and reported our position, you brought down enough federal troops to finish what was left of the resistance in eastern Tennessee. Did you know that, Sergeant? Did you know that your little reconnaissance report ended the war in 3 counties? Silas had known, actually. His escape from the ambush and subsequent report had indeed led to a major federal offensive that had broken the last organized Confederate resistance in the region. He'd considered it a small victory, justice for the men who died under Cole's guns. They were good soldiers, Silas said quietly. They deserved better than dying in your ambush, and I deserved better than spending 30 years planning my revenge, Cole replied. But here we are, 2 old soldiers settling accounts in the middle of nowhere. Almost poetic, don't you think? The wolf moved then, circling to flank Cole's position with fluid grace. But as it moved, something extraordinary happened. Its form seemed to shift and blur, as if the moonlight was bending around it in ways that defied physics. Cole noticed the movement and turned, raising his weapon toward the wolf. When he saw it clearly, his face went white with shock and recognition. Impossible, he breathed. You died. I saw you die in Elk Creek. The wolf stopped moving and regarded Cole with eyes that held 30 years of patient hatred. When it spoke, and Silas would swear to his dying day that it spoke, its voice carried the weight of decades and the promise of justice long delayed. Not quite, Marcus. Though you certainly tried hard enough. The voice was human, male, with an accent that spoke of education and authority. It was also unmistakably the voice of a dead man, Lieutenant James Morrison, Silas's commanding officer, who died in Cole's ambush with a Confederate blade between his ribs. As the impossible truth settled over the mountainside like a shroud, Silas understood that this confrontation involved far more than mining rights or territorial disputes. This was about unfinished business from a war that had ended before he was born, played out between adversaries who'd transcended the normal boundaries of life and death. The wolf that had been his partner, his friend, his salvation in these lonely mountains, was the vengeful spirit of the officer he'd failed to save 30 years ago. And the man who threatened to destroy everything he'd built here was the enemy who'd killed that officer in the first place. In the cold silence of the mountain night, 3 ghosts from America's bloodiest conflict prepared to settle accounts that should have been closed with the surrender at Appomattox. The silence that followed Morrison's impossible words stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 3 men faced each other across 30 years of death and hatred, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air that seemed to hang between them like the ghosts of all the battles they'd fought. Silas felt his grip on reality wavering. Everything he'd believed about the natural world, about life and death, about the wolf that had become his closest companion, crumbled like autumn leaves in his mind. The creature he'd nursed back to health, shared his home with, trusted with his life. It was the spirit of a man he'd failed to save during the darkest days of his youth. Lieutenant Morrison, he whispered. The old military courtesy coming automatically, despite the impossibility of the situation. The wolf, Morrison, turned those ancient eyes toward him, and now Silas could see what he'd missed before. The intelligence there wasn't animal cunning, but human wisdom, tempered by decades of existence beyond normal understanding. The tactical awareness, the strategic thinking, the way the creature had led him to threats and opportunities. It had been the mind of a trained officer working through the body of a natural predator. "Hello, Sergeant," Morrison said, his voice carrying warmth that transcended the supernatural circumstances. "You've aged well. These mountains have been good to you." Cole's bitter laughter cut through their reunion like a blade. "How touching. The failed soldier and his dead officer reunited at last. Do you have any idea what you cost me, Morrison? What your death accomplished?" "I know exactly what it accomplished," Morrison replied, his wolf form shifting slightly as he prepared for action. "It stopped you from massacring that supply train. It saved 300 Union soldiers who would have died in your next ambush. Most importantly, it brought you here, where this can finally be finished." Silas's mind raced as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Morrison hadn't just died in that Tennessee valley. He'd chosen to die, sacrificing himself to stop Cole's unit from continuing their deadly work. The ambush that had haunted Silas for 30 years hadn't been a failure of intelligence or tactics. It had been a deliberate sacrifice by an officer who'd understood the larger stakes. "You knew," Silas said. "You knew it was a trap when you sent me ahead." Morrison's wolf eyes held infinite sadness. Someone had to survive to report Cole's position. Someone had to make sure the intelligence reached headquarters. "I chose you because you were the best soldier in the unit, the one most likely to make it through. You sent me away to save my life," Silas continued, understanding flooding through him. "All these years I thought I'd failed you. Thought I was a coward for surviving when better men died. You were never a coward, Sergeant. You were chosen, just as you were chosen to find me in that trap last month, to help me heal, to stand with me when this moment came." Cole had been listening to this exchange with growing rage, his weathered face twisted by decades of hatred. "Enough of this sentimental reunion. You both cost me everything I'd built in the war. My unit was decimated, my reputation destroyed, my cause lost. I've spent 30 years planning this moment." "Then you've wasted 30 years, Morrison replied calmly, "because the cause you served was already lost. The war you're still fighting ended at Appomattox." "Not for me, it didn't," Cole snarled. "And when I'm done here, there'll be nothing left of either of you. Just 2 more casualties of a war that never really ended." Silas found his voice, steady now despite the supernatural circumstances. "This isn't about the war anymore, Cole. This is about a mining company trying to destroy these mountains. You're just using old grudges to justify corporate greed." Cole's smile was cold as winter stone. "The mining operation was convenient cover, I'll admit. Gave me legal justification to bring armed men into your territory. But you're wrong about my motivations, Sergeant. This has always been about finishing what we started in Tennessee." As if summoned by his words, shapes began moving in the forest around them. More men, emerging from concealment positions that Silas hadn't detected. Not just the corporate security team he'd expected, but something far more dangerous, soldiers who moved with the disciplined precision of a military unit. "Did you really think I'd come alone?" Cole continued. "I've been building this moment for 30 years, gathering resources and allies. Men who understand that some wars transcend politics, some causes survive the governments that spawn them." Morrison's hackles rose as he counted the approaching figures. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Enough," Cole replied. "More than enough to finish what should have been done 3 decades ago." But even as Cole spoke, Silas noticed something in the approaching men's movements that didn't fit with normal military deployment. They moved stiffly, mechanically, like marionettes controlled by an unseen puppeteer. Their eyes reflected the moonlight with an unnatural gleam, and their breathing formed no clouds in the frigid air. "Dear God," Silas breathed, understanding hitting him like a physical blow. "They're not alive, are they?" Cole's smile widened. "Death is just another kind of recruitment, Sergeant. I've had 30 years to gather my forces, to call in old debts and older loyalties. Some causes inspire such devotion that not even the grave can break them. The dead soldiers, for that's what they were," Silas realized with bone-deep certainty, formed a loose circle around their position. He counted at least a dozen, maybe more in the shadows beyond. Each carried weapons from the Civil War era, rifles and sabers that gleamed with supernatural menace in the moonlight. Morrison moved closer to Silas, his wolf form radiating protective intent. "This changes things," he said quietly. "Cole's not just seeking revenge, he's trying to refight the entire war with an army of the dead. Can we stop them?" Silas asked, checking his rifle's action with hands that remained steady despite the impossibility of their situation. "We can try," Morrison replied. "But this won't be won with conventional tactics. Cole's crossed lines that separate the living from the dead. We'll need to meet him on that ground if we want to stop him." Silas felt something shift inside him, a cold clarity that he recognized from his darkest moments during the war. Fear remained, but it was overwhelmed by purpose, the same sense of duty that had carried him through 2 years of combat and 37 years of guilt. Morrison had chosen him once before, trusted him to survive and carry out a crucial mission. Now he was being asked to do it again, under circumstances that transcended everything he thought he understood about life and death. "What do you need me to do, Lieutenant?" he asked, slipping back into the old military relationship as naturally as breathing. Morrison's wolf eyes gleamed with approval. "Same thing you did in Tennessee, Sergeant. Survive long enough to complete the mission. But this time, we finish it together." Cole raised his voice, addressing them across the circle of dead soldiers. "Last chance, gentlemen. Surrender now, and I'll make your deaths quick. Continue to resist, and I'll ensure you spend eternity regretting your choices." "Counter-proposal," Morrison called back. "You and your dead army return to whatever hell spawned you, and we'll consider letting you go in peace." Cole's laughter echoed off the canyon walls, like the sound of bones breaking. "I don't think you understand your situation. I have an army of the dead at my command, soldiers who've waited 30 years for this moment. What do you have?" Morrison looked at Silas, and in that gaze Silas saw not just the intelligence of his former commanding officer, but something deeper, the bond between soldiers who'd faced impossible odds together, who'd learned to trust each other beyond the boundaries of life and death. "We have something you've never understood, Marcus," Morrison said quietly. "We have loyalty that transcends your hate. We have purpose that goes beyond revenge. And we have 30 years of experience you can't match." As if triggered by his words, the temperature around them began to drop even further. Frost formed on the surrounding trees, and the air itself seemed to thicken with supernatural energy. Silas felt the change in his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with winter weather and everything to do with forces that existed beyond the natural world. The dead soldiers raised their weapons in perfect unison, a movement that spoke of supernatural coordination. But Morrison was already moving, his wolf form flowing like liquid shadow toward the nearest enemy. As he moved, his shape began to change, taking on aspects that were neither fully human nor fully animal, but something that transcended both. "Now, Sergeant," Morrison called over his shoulder. "Time to finish what we started." Silas raised his rifle and aimed at Cole, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just their survival, but the fate of the mountains they both called home. In the distance, he could hear the sound of wind rising, carrying with it voices from the past, the voices of all the soldiers who died in the war that had shaped them all, calling across the decades for justice at last. The battle began, with the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the canyon walls, but this was unlike any combat Silas had ever experienced. The dead soldiers moved with inhuman coordination, their antique weapons firing in perfect synchronization while they advanced through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in the darkness. Morrison flowed between them like a force of nature, his wolf form shifting and changing as he moved. One moment he was pure predator, jaws clamping down on spectral throats. The next, he was something else entirely, a shadow with human intelligence and animal grace that defied the supernatural soldier's attempts to corner him. Silas found his own rhythm in the chaos, falling back on training that had been burned into him during the bloodiest days of the war. His rifle spoke with mechanical precision, each shot aimed not to kill, these enemies were already dead, but to disrupt whatever force animated them. When his bullets found their marks, the dead soldiers staggered and fell, though they rose again within moments. "The weapons!" Morrison called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "Destroy their weapons, and you break their connection to this world." Understanding flooded through Silas as he watched one of the fallen soldiers struggle to rise without its rifle. The dead were anchored to the physical world through the tools of war they carried, the same weapons that had killed them decades ago. Break that connection, and they would lose their ability to affect the living world. He shifted his aim, targeting the ancient rifles and sabers that the spectral soldiers carried. The weapons shattered under his modern bullets, releasing bursts of cold light that seemed to pull their bearers back toward whatever realm they'd emerged from. One by one, the dead soldiers began to fade as their anchors to the physical world were destroyed. But Cole wasn't standing idle. The Confederate captain had taken cover behind a boulder and was working with something that made Silas's blood run cold. A field artillery piece that definitely hadn't been there moments before. The cannon was old, Civil War era, but it gleamed with the same supernatural energy that animated Cole's army. "Morrison!" Silas shouted in warning. The wolf spun toward the new threat just as Cole lit the cannon's fuse. The weapon belched fire and thunder, sending a charge of grapeshot that would have shredded any living target. But Morrison was no longer entirely bound by the limitations of physical form. He flowed around the deadly projectiles like smoke, reforming behind Cole's position. The two supernatural beings collided with force that shook the ground beneath Silas's feet. Cole had abandoned his human appearance, revealing the true nature of what he'd become during 30 years of nursing his hatred. His form was twisted, elongated, more shadow than substance, but radiating malevolence that seemed to darken the very air around him. They fought with weapons that existed beyond the physical world. Claws made of crystallized hatred, fangs that could tear souls as easily as flesh. Their battle created its own weather, winds that howled with the voices of the war dead, and temperatures that swung between furnace heat and Arctic cold. Silas continued his work with the remaining dead soldiers, methodically destroying their weapons and watching them fade back into whatever darkness had spawned them. But he could see that Morrison was losing ground against Cole's more focused malevolence. The wolf spirit fought with courage and skill, but 30 years of pure hatred had given Cole advantages that raw determination couldn't overcome. As the last of the dead soldiers faded away, Silas found himself alone with the two supernatural combatants. The mountain battlefield had become something from a nightmare, where the laws of physics bent around the conflict between spirits locked in eternal warfare. Cole broke away from Morrison and turned his attention to Silas, recognizing that the human represented the weak link in their supernatural alliance. "You want to save your precious mountains, Sergeant?" Cole snarled, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "Then take my place. One life for another, just like Tennessee. Your death will anchor me to this world permanently. Give me the power to reshape these peaks according to my will." Silas raised his rifle, knowing that conventional weapons would be useless against Cole's transformed state. But Morrison was already moving, placing himself between Silas and the approaching shadow. "No," Morrison said firmly. "This ends differently than Tennessee. This time, we all survive." The wolf began to change again, but this transformation was unlike anything Silas had witnessed before. Morrison's form expanded, becoming something that was part human, part wolf, and part something else entirely, the embodiment of every soldier who died, defending the principles that had made the war necessary. Cole recoiled from this new manifestation, his shadowy form wavering. "Impossible. You're just one dead officer. I command an entire army of the fallen." "You command nothing but your own hatred," Morrison replied, his voice now carrying the weight of every Union soldier who died to preserve the nation. "And hatred, Marcus, can always be overcome." The final confrontation was about to begin. The final battle between Morrison and Cole transcended the physical world entirely. They fought not just as individuals, but as embodiments of the forces that had driven the nation to tear itself apart. Duty against vengeance, healing against hatred, the future against a past that refused to die. Silas watched in awe as Morrison's transformed state grew more powerful with each exchange. The wolf spirit drew strength not from anger or hatred, but from something deeper, the love of the land they defended, the bonds between soldiers who trusted each other with their lives, the simple truth that some things were worth dying for and worth living to protect. Cole's shadow form lashed out with tendrils of crystallized malice, each strike capable of tearing apart both flesh and spirit. But Morrison met each attack with responses that seemed to channel the very essence of the mountains themselves. Stone-steady determination, wind-swift movement, and the patient strength of things that endured beyond human understanding. "You cannot win," Cole snarled, his form becoming more desperate and frantic as Morrison's power continued to grow. 30 years of planning, 30 years of gathering strength. "I will not be denied my victory." "You denied yourself victory the moment you chose hatred over healing," Morrison replied, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the bones of the earth itself. "The war ended, Marcus. You could have found peace, could have built something new. Instead, you chose to become a monument to old pain." The truth of those words hit Cole like a physical blow. For just a moment, his shadow form wavered, revealing glimpses of the man he'd once been. Younger, less consumed by bitterness, carrying the same dedication to cause and country that had motivated Morrison. But that glimpse of humanity lasted only seconds before being consumed again by the darkness he'd cultivated for 3 decades. Peace? Cole laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "There can be no peace while the victors profit from our defeat. These mountains will be stripped bare, their wealth feeding the same industrial machine that destroyed the Old South. At least, my hatred serves a purpose." "Your hatred serves only itself," Morrison said quietly. "And that's why it will fail." The wolf spirit began to glow within a light that had nothing to do with supernatural power and everything to do with purpose. This wasn't the cold fire of vengeance or the hot flame of anger. It was the steady warmth of a campfire shared between friends, the gentle light of dawn breaking over familiar peaks, the quiet satisfaction of work done well and duty fulfilled. Cole's shadow form recoiled from that light, his substance becoming less solid as it touched him. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No, I will not be defeated by sentiment and nostalgia. I am hatred perfected, rage refined to its purest essence. And that," Morrison said sadly, "is exactly why you've already lost." The final exchange happened faster than human eyes could follow. Cole struck with everything he'd accumulated over 30 years of nursing his grievances. Every slight, every defeat, every moment of pain focused into a single attack that should have destroyed any opponent. But Morrison didn't meet hatred with hatred. Instead, he absorbed Cole's assault and transformed it, the way a mountain absorbs a storm and turns it into life-giving snow. The dark energy that Cole had wielded like a weapon was transmuted into something else entirely. Understanding, forgiveness, and the kind of peace that comes only after long struggle. Cole's scream echoed across the mountains as his shadow form began to dissolve. But in that cry, Silas heard something unexpected, not just rage and defeat, but relief. As if some part of the man Marcus Cole had once been was grateful to finally lay down the burden of hatred he'd carried for so long. "I'm sorry," Cole whispered as his form faded. "I'm sorry it took so long to remember who I used to be." Morrison's glowing form reached out to the dissolving shadow, offering not conquest, but compassion. "We all forgot who we used to be, Marcus, but now you can remember. Now you can rest." As Cole's presence faded completely, the supernatural energy that had charged the air began to dissipate. The temperature returned to normal. The unnatural darkness lifted, and the mountains settled back into their eternal quiet. The dead soldiers, their anchor to the physical world severed with their commander's defeat, vanished like morning mist. Morrison's transformed state began to fade as well, his form shrinking back toward the familiar wolf shape that Silas had come to know and trust. But something had changed in the process. The spirit wolf looked more solid now, more connected to the physical world, as if the act of choosing forgiveness over vengeance had strengthened rather than diminished him. "Is it over?" Silas asked, his voice hoarse from the supernatural cold. Morrison turned those ancient eyes toward him, and Silas saw in them not just the wisdom of his old commanding officer, but something new, peace, hard-won and deeply earned. "It's over," Morrison confirmed. "The war, the hatred, the need for vengeance, all of it ends here." As dawn began to break over the mountains they'd fought to protect, Silas felt something shift in his own heart, a weight he'd carried for 30 years, finally lifting, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and friendship honored. 3 weeks later, the mining company's lawyers arrived to find their operation in shambles. The surveillance team had vanished without explanation, their equipment scattered and their reports so incoherent that no corporate executive could make sense of them. The surveyor's carefully marked stakes had been pulled up and stacked neatly beside the access road, accompanied by a simple note: "Trespassers will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." More mysteriously, every document related to the mining rights had somehow become corrupted or lost. Computer files developed inexplicable errors. Physical papers suffered from mysterious coffee stains and ink blots that made them legally worthless. And key witnesses suddenly developed convenient cases of amnesia about the entire project. The Forest Service rangers who returned to check on Silas found him in excellent health and uncharacteristically talkative. He regaled them with detailed stories about the mining company's illegal activities, complete with photographs that mysteriously appeared in his possession and recordings that captured conversations no human could have overheard. Within a month, the corporate executives found themselves facing federal charges for environmental violations, illegal surveillance, and attempting to intimidate a lawful resident of federal land. Silas never explained how he'd acquired such comprehensive evidence, and the rangers were too grateful for his cooperation to ask uncomfortable questions. The mining operation was shut down permanently, the land designated as a protected wilderness area, and Silas's right to remain in his cabin was formally recognized by federal decree. But these external victories, satisfying as they were, paled in comparison to the internal changes that the supernatural confrontation had wrought. Morrison remained, but he was different now, more present, more connected to the physical world than he'd been as a purely spiritual entity. The wolf form had become truly his, rather than just a convenient vessel for an earthbound spirit. During the day, he was every inch the magnificent predator that had first caught Silas's attention in the trap. But in the evenings, when they sat together on the cabin porch watching the sunset paint the peaks, his eyes held depths of human understanding that transcended species boundaries. They didn't speak often in the old way. Morrison's ability to manifest human speech seemed to have faded with Cole's defeat. But they developed a form of communication that went deeper than words, an understanding built on shared experience and mutual respect that made conversation unnecessary. A look, a gesture, a simple positioning of bodies in space conveyed more meaning than most humans managed with entire speeches. The seasonal rhythms that had defined Silas's life for 37 years took on new dimensions with Morrison's presence. The wolf's supernatural senses provided early warning of weather changes, and his knowledge of the land's hidden secrets led them to resources that Silas had never discovered despite decades of exploration. More importantly, the simple companionship transformed solitary tasks into shared experiences. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, bringing with it signs of renewal that seemed to reflect the spiritual healing that had taken place during the winter's supernatural conflicts. The forest responded to Morrison's presence in subtle ways. Predators gave their cabin a respectful distance. Prey animals showed less fear when the wolf was near, and even the weather seemed to moderate its extremes around their shared territory. Silas found himself writing longer entries in his journal, recording not just weather observations and trap results, but reflections on the nature of friendship, loyalty, and the unexpected ways that life could surprise a man who thought he'd seen everything. His handwriting, steady and precise for decades, took on subtle flourishes that spoke of contentment he'd never expected to experience. One evening in late spring, as they sat watching a family of elk graze in the meadow below the cabin, Morrison did something that perfectly captured the transformation their relationship had undergone. Instead of maintaining his usual position at a respectful distance, The wolf moved closer and rested his massive head against Silas's leg, not seeking comfort or offering protection, but simply sharing companionship with a friend, you know, Silas said quietly, his hand finding its way to Morrison's silver-gray fur. I spent 30 years thinking I'd failed you in Tennessee, thinking I was a coward who ran when better men stayed to fight. Morrison's ears flicked toward his voice, and those ancient eyes looked up with understanding that transcended the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things, Silas continued. About duty, about survival, about what it means to be loyal to something bigger than yourself. You taught me that friendship doesn't end with death, that some bonds are stronger than time or circumstance or even the grave. The wolf pressed closer, and in that simple gesture, Silas felt the weight of 3 decades' guilt finally lift completely. He'd been chosen, first to survive the Tennessee ambush, then to find Morrison in the trap, finally to stand with him against the forces that threatened their mountain sanctuary. Not because he was the best soldier or the most deserving, but because some friendships were meant to transcend the normal boundaries of life and death. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Silas reflected on how dramatically his understanding of solitude had changed. For most of his adult life, he'd equated being alone with being safe, believing that independence was the highest virtue a man could achieve. But Morrison's presence had taught him that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection, the kind of bond that made 2 beings stronger together than either could be. Alone, the mountains around them settled into their eternal quiet. But it was no longer the silence of abandonment that had defined Silas's earlier years. This was the peaceful quiet of a home shared with a friend, the comfortable stillness of 2 old soldiers who'd fought their last war and found something better than victory. They'd found understanding. In the distance, a wolf howled, not Morrison, but one of the wild pack that roamed the higher peaks. Morrison lifted his head and answered with a call that carried notes of both human wisdom and animal wildness, a sound that perfectly embodied the unique nature of what he'd become. Silas smiled and settled back in his chair, completely content for the first time in his long life. Whatever tomorrow might bring, he would face it with the best friend a man could ask for, one whose loyalty had proven stronger than death itself.